My sister Rachel snipped through my 3-day-old daughter's hospital identification bracelet with surgical scissors while I was recovering from an emergency C-section, claiming it was medically necessary because the baby was clearly not getting proper care. What she didn't know was that my husband wasn't just any Marine. He was General Marcus Sullivan, and his entire command structure was about to learn exactly what happens when someone threatens a Marine's family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But let me back up to where this nightmare actually began, because the hospital bracelet incident was just the explosive climax of 28 years of my sister thinking she could control every aspect of my life. My name is Elena Sullivan, though 3 days ago I was still Elena Rodriguez, and I was lying in a recovery bed at Mercy General Hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado, cradling my newborn daughter, Sophia Marie Sullivan. She was perfect. 6 pounds, 2 ounces of pure miracle with her father's strong jaw and my dark eyes. After 18 hours of labor, followed by an emergency cesarean when her heart rate dropped, I was exhausted, sore, and completely overwhelmed by the fierce, protective love that had taken over my entire being. Marcus had been deployed for the final month of my pregnancy, leading a classified operation somewhere in the Middle East that he couldn't discuss even with me. Military wives learn early that there are parts of their husbands' lives that exist in shadows, protected by security clearances and the weight of national importance. I'd given birth alone, except for my mother, who'd flown in from Phoenix, and my sister Rachel, who'd driven down from Denver with her husband Kevin and their twin boys. The plan had been simple. Family support during the birth, help getting settled at home, and Marcus would return when the mission concluded. What I hadn't anticipated was that Rachel would see my temporary vulnerability as an opportunity to completely take over my life. It started small, the way these things always do. Comments about the hospital room being too cold for the baby, suggestions that I wasn't holding Sophia correctly, questions about whether I was producing enough breast milk delivered with that concerned sister voice that made my doubts multiply like bacteria in a petri dish. "Elena, sweetie," Rachel said on my second day postpartum, adjusting the blanket around Sophia for the 4th time in an hour. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay for a few extra days? I mean, with Marcus deployed and you're recovering from major surgery, it seems irresponsible to be alone with a newborn." I was propped up in the hospital bed, still connected to an IV, wearing the attractive mesh underwear and industrial-strength maxi pads that are the reality of post-childbirth recovery. My incision ached with every movement, and I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, but holding my daughter made everything else fade into background noise. "The nurses said I'm healing well," I replied carefully, "and Marcus should be home soon. We'll be fine." Rachel exchanged a look with my mother that I caught but couldn't quite interpret. It was the same look they'd shared when I'd announced my engagement to Marcus 2 years ago. A mixture of concern and something that felt uncomfortably like pity. "Honey, we're just worried about you being alone with the baby, especially since Marcus has gone so much with his job." The way she said job made it sound like Marcus was an unreliable contractor rather than a decorated Marine Corps general who'd served his country for over 2 decades. This wasn't the first time my family had struggled to understand or respect his military career, but their timing couldn't have been worse. "His deployment ends this week," I said, trying to keep the defensiveness out of my voice. "He'll be here." "Will he, though?" Rachel asked, and there was something sharp in her tone that made me look up from Sophia's face. "I mean, Elena, you've been married for 2 years, and how often is he actually home? How often has he been here for the important things?" The question hit exactly where she'd aimed it, at the insecurity I'd been carrying throughout my entire pregnancy. Marcus had missed the anatomy scan when they told us we were having a girl. He'd been in meetings during my baby shower. He'd been unreachable when I'd had that scary bleeding episode at 32 weeks that had sent me to the emergency room in a panic. But he'd also been serving his country, leading missions that saved lives and protected freedoms that my family took for granted. The weight of that responsibility wasn't something I took lightly, even when it meant lonely nights and missed moments. "He's doing important work," I said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss to Sophia's forehead. "More important than his wife and newborn daughter?" Rachel's voice carried that particular blend of concern and judgment that she'd perfected over the years. "Elena, I'm not trying to be harsh, but you need to be realistic about what your life is going to look like. Military marriages have a 73% divorce rate for a reason." Kevin, Rachel's husband, shifted uncomfortably in the corner where he'd been scrolling through his phone. He was a good man who worked in IT and coached a little league on weekends, but he'd never served in the military and clearly felt out of his depth in this conversation. "Maybe we should let Elena rest," he suggested diplomatically.
"No, this is important," Rachel insisted, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the hospital's parking lot. "Elena, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think you should consider moving back to Phoenix, at least temporarily. Mom could help with the baby, I could drive down on weekends, and you wouldn't be alone all the time." The suggestion hit me like cold water. Move back to Phoenix? Leave the home Marcus and I had built together in Colorado Springs? Abandon the life we'd carefully constructed around his duty station and my work as a pediatric nurse? "I'm not moving back to Phoenix," I said, more firmly than I'd spoken since they'd arrived. "This is my home. Marcus's home. Sophia's home." "But what kind of home is it really?" Rachel turned from the window, and I could see she was building up to something big. "Elena, you're 26 years old. You're beautiful, you're smart, you're a registered nurse with great career prospects. Why are you tying yourself to a man who's never going to prioritize you? Who's going to miss birthday parties and school plays and soccer games because the military always comes first?" My mother nodded along, clearly having discussed this with Rachel beforehand. "Sweetheart, we just want you to be happy, to have a partner who's actually present for your life." I felt tears building behind my eyes, the postpartum hormones making everything feel amplified and raw. The truth was, I did worry about those things. I did wonder if Marcus would miss important moments, if the demands of his career would always create distance between us. But I also knew something my family had never bothered to understand. Marcus wasn't just my husband, he was my partner in every sense that mattered. When he was home, he was completely present. When he held me, I felt like the most important person in his world. When he talked about our future, about Sophia, about the life we were building together, I could see the depth of his commitment in every word. "You don't understand," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "You don't understand what we have, what he means to me, what this family means to him." "What I understand," Rachel said, sitting on the edge of my hospital bed with the confidence of someone who believed she was delivering necessary truth, "is that you're about to be a single mother in everything but name. And that's not fair to you or to this baby." She reached out and gently touched Sophia's tiny hand, and the gesture was so tender, so seemingly loving, that it made her words even more devastating. "I think you should seriously consider whether this is the life you want for your daughter, growing up with a father who's essentially absent, learning that love means always coming second to duty and honor, and whatever mission is more important than family dinner." The tears were flowing now, exhaustion and hormones and doubt all combining into a perfect storm of vulnerability. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe I was being naive about what military life would really mean for Sophia. Maybe I was setting my daughter up for a childhood of disappointment and abandonment. "Elena," my mother said gently, "we're not saying you have to make any decisions right now. We're just saying you have options. You have family who love you and want to support you." But as I looked at my sister's face, at the certainty in her eyes that she knew what was best for my life, I felt something else underneath the tears and doubt. A flicker of resistance, a small voice that reminded me of who I'd been before exhaustion and surgery and postpartum vulnerability had made me forget. I was Elena Rodriguez Sullivan, a woman who'd fallen in love with a man whose strength and honor and dedication had drawn me like a magnet. I was a pediatric nurse who'd worked in neonatal intensive care units and seen families fight and possible battles with grace and determination. I was someone who'd chosen to build a life with a Marine because I understood that some things were worth sacrificing for, worth fighting for, worth believing in even when the path got difficult. And as I held my daughter closer, feeling her tiny body warm against my chest, I realized that Rachel's words weren't just an attack on my marriage, they were an attack on the woman I'd become, an attempt to pull me back into the smaller version of myself that had always needed her approval, her guidance, her permission to make important life decisions. But that version of Elena didn't exist anymore. And in about 12 hours, when Rachel decided to take her concern for my family to a whole new level, she was going to find out exactly who she was really dealing with. The storm was coming, and Rachel had no idea she was about to meet the full force of a Marine general's protective instincts, backed by the weight of military authority and a husband who'd move heaven and earth to defend his family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The next morning brought a shift change that would prove to be the beginning of Rachel's complete overreach. Nurse Patricia Williams, a veteran NICU nurse with 23 years of experience and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from saving premature babies, entered my room during her rounds to find Rachel rearranging the entire space like she was redecorating her own home. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Patricia said warmly, checking my chart. "How are we feeling today? Any increase in pain? How's the incision site?" Before I could answer, Rachel stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed she had authority in this situation. "Actually, I've been monitoring Elena closely, and I have some concerns about her recovery progress."
Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. She was a woman who dealt with every type of family dynamic imaginable, but there was something in Rachel's tone that immediately put her on alert. "And you are?" "Rachel Martinez, Elena's sister. I'm a registered nurse myself," Rachel said, which was technically true. She'd worked in a dermatology clinic for 3 years before becoming a stay-at-home mom. "I've been staying here overnight to monitor both Elena and the baby, and I think there might be some issues with Elena's pain management protocol." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Rachel, I'm fine. The pain is manageable." "No, you're not fine," Rachel said firmly, turning to Patricia with the authority of someone delivering a medical consultation. "She's been crying intermittently, she's not sleeping well, and I'm concerned that inadequate pain control is affecting her ability to bond with the baby and establish proper breastfeeding." Patricia's expression had shifted to professional neutrality, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd encountered this type of family member before. "Mrs. Sullivan, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your current pain level?" "About a 4, I said honestly. "It's sore, but nothing I can't handle." "She's minimizing," Rachel interjected before Patricia could respond. "Elena has always been someone who downplays her needs. She rated her labor pain as manageable right up until they had to do an emergency C-section because her body couldn't handle the stress." The way Rachel twisted the facts, making my emergency cesarean sound like a failure on my part rather than a medical necessity when Sophia's heart rate dropped, was so subtle and so practiced that I almost didn't catch it myself. But Patricia did. "Mrs. Martinez," Patricia said with cool professionalism, "while I appreciate your concern for your sister, pain assessment and management decisions need to be between Mrs. Sullivan and her medical team. If she's comfortable with her current level, then we're managing appropriately." Rachel's smile didn't waver, but I saw something flash in her eyes, the same look she'd worn as a teenager when teachers or coaches didn't immediately accept her version of events. "Of course, I understand. I'm just advocating for my sister since she tends to be too accommodating for her own good." After Patricia left, promising to return with the discharge paperwork since I was healing ahead of schedule, Rachel settled into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd made her point. But her next move was what really opened my eyes to how far she was willing to go. "Elena," she said, pulling out her phone and opening what looked like a note-taking app, I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday, and I want to help you make the best decision for Sophia's future. So, I've been documenting some things. My stomach dropped. Documenting what things? Just observations. Times when you seemed overwhelmed, instances when the baby cried for extended periods, moments when you appeared to be struggling with basic care tasks. She scrolled through her phone with the casual efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. Nothing judgmental, just facts that might be helpful if you decide to pursue legal options regarding custody or support. The words hit me like ice water. Legal options? Rachel, what are you talking about? Well, if you decide that Marcus's military commitments make him an unsuitable primary co-parent, or if you need to establish that you require additional family support due to his extended absences, documentation could be important. Her voice was gentle, concerned, as if she were offering helpful advice rather than building a case against my husband and my fitness as a mother. I'm not pursuing any legal options, I said, my voice stronger than it had been since I'd given birth. Marcus and I are married. We're raising Sophia together. There's no custody issue because we're a family. Rachel's expression shifted to what I'd learned to recognize as her "Elena is being naive again" face. Honey, I know you want to believe that, but military marriages are complicated. And when you add a baby to the mix, especially when the father isn't present for bonding and isn't available for the day-to-day responsibilities, she trailed off meaningfully, letting the implication hang in the air between us. What exactly are you documenting, Rachel? I asked, a cold dread settling in my chest. She turned her phone screen toward me, and what I saw made my blood pressure spike. Detailed notes with timestamps, 3:47 a.m., Elena crying while attempting to breastfeed, baby crying for 12 minutes before successful latch. 8:23 a.m., Elena appeared confused about diaper changing procedure, required assistance from the nursing staff. 11:15 a.m., Elena expressed doubts about ability to care for infant alone. Every normal moment of learning to be a new mother, every instance of postpartum emotion, every question I'd asked the nurses had been recorded and reframed as evidence of my inadequacy. Rachel, I said, my voice shaking with something that was no longer exhaustion but pure anger. Delete those notes right now. Elena, calm down. I'm trying to help you. If Marcus's career prevents him from being an equal partner in parenting, and if you need additional support, these kinds of records could be crucial for establishing your case for family assistance or modified custody arrangements. Modified custody arrangements? I repeated, the words barely above a whisper. Rachel, are you planning to try to take my baby? Her expression immediately shifted to shocked innocence. Take your baby? Elena, how could you even think that? I'm trying to protect you and Sophia. I'm trying to make sure you have options if this marriage doesn't work out the way you hope. But I'd seen something in her eyes when I'd asked the question directly. A flicker of something that looked less like protection and more like possession. And suddenly, all of Rachel's concern about my marriage, all of her suggestions about moving back to Phoenix, all of her observations about Marcus's unsuitability as a father crystallized into a pattern I should have recognized sooner. This wasn't about protecting me or Sophia. This was about Rachel seeing an opportunity to be the hero, to save her helpless little sister and raise a baby she could mold and control the way she'd never quite been able to control me once I'd moved away and built my own life. I want you to delete those notes, I said again, sitting up straighter despite the pain in my incision. And I want you to stop treating my recovery like a failure and my marriage like a mistake. Rachel's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the flash of irritation that she quickly covered with renewed concern. Elena, you're clearly emotional right now. Postpartum hormones can make everything feel overwhelming. Maybe you should talk to someone about— The only person I need to talk to is my husband, I interrupted, and I want you to give me some space to do that. For the first time since she had arrived, Rachel looked genuinely surprised. I'd been compliant, grateful for her help, accepting of her advice and criticism. The idea that I might actually push back against her guidance seemed to catch her completely off guard. Space? She repeated. Elena, you just had major surgery. You can't be alone with a newborn. I'm not alone. I'm in a hospital with a nursing staff that's been taking excellent care of me and Sophia. I can call for help if I need it. But what if something happens? What if the baby has a problem and you don't recognize the signs? What if your incision opens or you develop an infection? Her voice was rising now, the careful concern giving way to something more desperate. Elena, you're not thinking clearly. And there it was, the pattern I'd been too tired and vulnerable to recognize. Every time I'd asserted independence throughout my life, Rachel had found a way to make it about my inadequacy, my poor judgment, my need for her protection and guidance. When I'd chosen to go to nursing school instead of the business program she'd recommended, I was not thinking about job security. When I'd moved to Colorado for my first position, I was running away from family support. When I'd fallen in love with Marcus, I was getting swept up in fantasy instead of facing reality. But now, holding my 3-day-old daughter and seeing my sister's carefully documented attempts to build a case for my incompetence as a mother, I realized something that changed everything. Rachel had never been protecting me from making mistakes. She'd been protecting herself from losing control over my life. I am thinking clearly, I said, my voice steady for the first time since she had arrived. Clearly enough to know that what you're doing isn't helping me. It's undermining me. Rachel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally calculated determination. Fine, she said, standing up and gathering her purse with sharp, efficient movements. If you want to handle everything alone, if you want to reject help from family who love you, that's your choice. But Elena, when this gets overwhelming, and it will, don't expect everyone to drop everything to rescue you. She paused at the door, and the look she gave me was one I'd never seen before. Cold, assessing, and somehow threatening. I hope for Sophia's sake that you know what you're doing, because babies don't care about pride or independence. They need reliable, consistent care from people who put their needs first. After she left, I sat in the sudden quiet of my hospital room, holding Sophia close and trying to process what had just happened. My sister, the person who'd helped raise me, who'd taught me to braid my hair and stood up to bullies on my behalf, had just spent 3 days systematically documenting my vulnerable moments to build some kind of case against my fitness as a mother. But what terrified me more than Rachel's manipulations was the realization that this was probably just the beginning. She'd left, but she hadn't given up, and something in her final look had promised that if I wouldn't accept her help voluntarily, she might find other ways to ensure that Sophia got the reliable, consistent care she believed only our family could provide. I picked up my phone to call Marcus, but remembered he was still in communication blackout for his mission. For the first time since Sophia's birth, I felt truly alone. Not because my husband was deployed, but because I just discovered that my own sister saw my new family as something that needed to be dismantled for my own good. What I didn't know was that Rachel's next move would cross a line that would bring the full weight of military authority down on her head, and that within 18 hours, my quiet, diplomatic sister would learn exactly what happened when someone threatened a Marine general's family. Rachel returned the next morning with reinforcements, and I should have known she wouldn't accept defeat so easily. She arrived at 7 a.m. sharp with our mother, my Aunt Carmen, and a woman I didn't recognize, a sharp-featured brunette in business attire who introduced herself as Linda Hayes, a family advocate with Children and Family Services. Elena, Charlotte, my mother rushed to my bedside with the kind of dramatic concern usually reserved for deathbed vigils. Rachel told us about your conversation yesterday, and we're all so worried about you.
I was sitting up in bed, having just finished feeding Sophia, feeling stronger and more clear-headed than I had since the surgery. The antibiotics had kicked in, my pain was manageable, and most importantly, I'd spent the night thinking about everything Rachel had said and done. The documentation, the legal implications, the systematic undermining of my confidence, it all painted a picture I didn't like. "I'm fine, Mom," I said carefully, aware that anything I said would likely be analyzed and potentially used against me later. "Sophia and I are both doing well. The doctors are pleased with our progress." Linda Hayes stepped forward with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan,
I want you to know that we're not here in any official capacity. Your sister reached out to our family support services because she was concerned about your transition to motherhood, particularly given your husband's military deployment. My blood turned to ice. You called CFS on me? I asked Rachel, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't call anyone on you, Rachel said quickly. I reached out for resources. Linda specializes in supporting military families during challenging transitions. She's here to help. But Linda Hayes was already scanning the room with the trained eye of someone who assessed family situations for a living. She noted the flowers from Marcus's unit, the cards from my colleagues at the hospital, the baby supplies that marked me as prepared and cared for. Her expression suggested she wasn't seeing whatever Rachel had described to her. Mrs. Sullivan, Linda said, pulling out a small notebook, can you tell me about your support system? Who will be helping you when you're discharged? My husband will be home from deployment within the week. I have excellent childcare resources through the base, and I'm a pediatric nurse myself, so I'm comfortable with infant care. But what about immediate support? Aunt Carmen interjected. Elena, honey, you can't lift anything heavier than the baby for 6 weeks. How are you going to manage grocery shopping, cleaning, cooking? Before I could answer, there was a knock on the door. Nurse Patricia entered, followed by a woman in navy dress blues whose presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Mrs. Sullivan, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen from the Family Readiness Group. She's here for your support visit. Lieutenant Commander Chen was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of bearing that suggested she'd dealt with every crisis a military family could face. She took in the crowd of people in my room with a single glance that missed nothing. Ma'am, she said to me with a respectful nod, I apologize for the unexpected visit, but we received a call yesterday from someone claiming to be family, expressing concerns about your welfare and that of your infant daughter. Rachel's face went pale. I was just trying to make sure Elena had access to all available resources. And you are? Lieutenant Commander Chen's voice was polite, but carried the underlying authority of someone accustomed to command. Rachel Martinez, Elena's sister. I see. She consulted a tablet she was carrying. Mrs. Martinez, when you contacted our family services yesterday, you indicated that Mrs. Sullivan was experiencing significant postpartum complications and that her husband's deployment had left her without adequate support. You suggested that intervention might be necessary to ensure the welfare of the infant. The room went dead silent. Even my mother looked shocked at the clinical description of whatever story Rachel had told. That's not exactly what I said, Rachel protested. I was just asking about available support programs. Lieutenant Commander Chen's expression didn't change. Ma'am, I have the recording of the call. Our family services document all contacts for quality assurance purposes. Would you like me to play back your specific concerns? I watched Rachel's face cycle through several emotions as she realized that her attempt to manipulate military resources had been thoroughly documented. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd been building a case against me had been recorded building a false case against my family. I think there may have been some miscommunication, Rachel said weakly. Perhaps, Chen agreed diplomatically. She turned to me with a completely different demeanor. Mrs. Sullivan, I've reviewed your family's record with our services. Your husband's unit commander speaks very highly of both of you. His previous deployments have been handled smoothly, and you've been an active participant in family readiness activities. Is there anything you need from our support services at this time? The question was clearly a formality. Chen had already assessed the situation and found it to be nothing like what Rachel had described. But her presence had accomplished something entirely different. It had revealed the extent to which Rachel was willing to go to prove her point about my inadequacy. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. I believe we have everything we need. Outstanding. I'll update your file to reflect that all family members are healthy and adapting well to the new addition. She made a note on her tablet. Mrs. Martinez, in the future, if you have concerns about a military family's welfare, I'd recommend speaking directly with a family member first. Our intervention services are designed for genuine crises, not preventative consultations. The reprimand was delivered so politely that it took Rachel a moment to realize she'd been thoroughly dressed down by a military officer who'd essentially called her report fraudulent.
After Chen left, the dynamics in the room had shifted completely. Linda Hayes was looking at Rachel with the expression of someone who'd been misled about the nature of an emergency. My mother was staring at her oldest daughter like she was seeing her clearly for the first time. Aunt Carmen was studying her fingernails with the intensity of someone pretending not to witness a family implosion. "Rachel," my mother said slowly, "did you really call the military and tell them Elena was having problems?"
"I was trying to help," Rachel said, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "I was trying to make sure she had access to support services. By telling them I was having complications and that my baby was at risk?" I asked, my own voice getting stronger. "Rachel, that woman came here prepared to assess whether Sophia was in danger. Do you understand what could have happened if she'd believed whatever story you told her?" "I never said the baby was in danger," Rachel protested. "I just said you might need additional support." Linda Hayes cleared her throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Martinez, the information you provided to our intake coordinator did suggest that there were concerns about the mother's ability to provide adequate care, particularly in light of postpartum complications and lack of family support." "That's not what I meant," Rachel said. But she was backpedaling now, realizing that her manipulation had been exposed in front of witnesses who couldn't be controlled or convinced. "What exactly did you mean?" I asked, sitting up straighter in bed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been systematically documenting my vulnerable moments, calling government agencies to report problems that don't exist, and trying to convince everyone who listen that my marriage is doomed and my baby would be better off with different arrangements." The room went completely silent. Even Linda Hayes was watching with the fascination of someone witnessing a family dynamic she hadn't expected. "Elena," my mother said quietly, "is that true? Has Rachel been documenting things?" I looked at my sister, giving her one last chance to come clean, to admit what she'd been doing and why. But instead of honesty, I saw calculation in her eyes. She was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make herself the victim of my postpartum irrationality. "Show them your phone, Rachel," I said calmly. "Show them the notes you've been taking about my inadequacy as a mother and wife." "I don't have to show anyone anything," Rachel snapped, and I resent the implication that trying to help my sister makes me some kind of villain. But Aunt Carmen, who'd been quiet throughout this entire exchange, spoke up with the weight of her 73 years and her experience raising 5 children of her own. "Rachel, mija," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "helping doesn't look like calling the government on your sister. Helping doesn't look like making lists of her mistakes. Helping looks like bringing food, doing laundry, and telling her she's doing a good job when she's learning something new and scary." The simplicity of the statement hit Rachel like a physical blow. Her face crumbled, but instead of remorse, I saw something that looked more like fury. "Fine," she said, grabbing her purse and coat. "Fine. When this all falls apart, when Marcus chooses his career over his family, when Elena realizes she can't handle everything alone, don't come running to me for help." She stormed toward the door, but turned back with one final shot. "And Elena, when your daughter grows up wondering why her father was never there for anything important, remember that you chose this. You chose to push away the people who actually care about you for a man who treats his family like a hobby he pursues between deployments." The door slammed behind her, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. My mother sank into the visitor's chair, looking older than I'd seen her in years. "Elena, I had no idea she was... I never would have supported this if I'd known what she was really doing." Linda Hayes was packing up her materials with the efficiency of someone who'd realized her services weren't needed. "Mrs. Sullivan, I apologize for the intrusion. It appears there was some confusion about the nature of your family's situation." After everyone left, I sat alone with Sophia, processing what had just happened. Rachel's mask had finally slipped completely, revealing not a concerned sister, but someone whose need to control had escalated to frightening levels.
She'd been willing to involve government agencies to create false narratives about my fitness as a mother, and trying to convince everyone who'll listen that my marriage is doomed and my baby would be better off with different arrangements. But something else had happened in that room. For the first time, I've stood up to Rachel without backing down, without allowing her to reframe the situation or make me doubt my own perceptions. I'd called her out in front of witnesses, and she had revealed herself so completely that even our mother had seen the truth. What I didn't know was that Rachel's departure was just a strategic retreat. She hadn't given up on her mission to save me from my choices. In fact, her next move would be so extreme, so calculated to cause maximum damage, that it would finally bring my husband home with the full force of military authority behind him. The hospital bracelet incident happened at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 6 hours before Marcus was scheduled to land at Denver International Airport. I know the precise time because the security cameras captured everything, and because that timestamp would later become crucial evidence in what followed. I was dozing when Rachel slipped back into my room. After her dramatic exit the day before, I hadn't expected to see her again, at least not without some kind of apology or explanation. Instead, she entered quietly, almost stealthily, carrying a small medical bag that I initially assumed belonged to the hospital staff.
"Elena," she whispered, "are you awake?" I opened my eyes to find her standing beside Sophia's bassinet, not beside my bed. That detail would stick with me later. She hadn't come to check on me, her sister recovering from major surgery. She'd come for the baby. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" I struggled to sit up, my incision protesting the sudden movement. "I needed to apologize," she said, but her attention remained focused on Sophia. "I was wrong yesterday. I was stressed and scared for you, and I handled everything badly." It sounded like the Rachel I'd grown up with, contrite, reasonable, concerned for my well-being. But something about her posture, the way she was studying my daughter instead of looking at me, set off every alarm bell I'd developed over 30 decades of being her sister. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but maybe we should talk about this when I'm discharged. I'm still pretty tired." "Actually, that's why I'm here." Rachel finally looked at me, and her expression was one I'd never seen before, determined, almost clinical. "Elena, I've been thinking about what Lieutenant Commander Chen said yesterday about military families and support systems." She reached into the medical bag and pulled out what looked like surgical scissors. My heart rate spiked, but she was already moving towards Sophia's bassinet with the purposeful stride of someone who'd planned this moment carefully. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" I struggled to sit up, my incision protesting the sudden movement. "I'm helping," she said simply. "This baby's identification bracelet is too tight. Look at it. It's cutting into her wrist. That's dangerous. It could cut off circulation." I looked at Sophia's tiny wrist where the standard hospital bracelet was secured. It was snug, as hospital bracelets were designed to be, to prevent them from slipping off, but it wasn't tight enough to cause harm. Any nurse would confirm that. "Rachel, don't touch that bracelet. If there's a problem, I'll call the nurse." But she was already lifting Sophia from the bassinet, supporting her with one arm while raising the scissors with the other. "Elena, I'm a nurse too. I can see that this is too tight. Sometimes you have to act quickly to prevent injury. Put my daughter down right now." My voice carried authority I didn't know I possessed, the kind of command that came from some primal maternal instinct. Rachel paused, but didn't lower the scissors. "Elena, you're being emotional. This is a medical necessity. Look at how red her wrist is getting." She angled Sophia so I could see the baby's wrist, and I realized with cold horror that Rachel had been manipulating the bracelet, twisting it to make it appear tighter than it was. She'd created the medical emergency she was now claiming to address. "Rachel, put my baby down and step away from the bassinet." "I can't do that," she said, and now her voice carried the same clinical determination I'd heard when she'd tried to convince everyone I was an unfit mother. "Elena, you're not thinking clearly.
Postpartum hormones are affecting your judgment. I can see a problem that needs immediate attention, and as a medical professional and as Sophia's aunt, I have a responsibility to act. She positioned the scissors against the hospital bracelet, and I realized with crystal clarity what was really happening. This wasn't about a tight bracelet. This was about Rachel creating a crisis that would require hospital intervention, documentation, and evidence that I couldn't recognize or respond appropriately to my baby's medical needs. "If you cut that bracelet," I said, my voice deadly calm, "I will call security, I will call the police, and I will make sure you never see Sophia again." Rachel's hand trembled slightly, but she didn't lower the scissors. "Elena, you're threatening me for trying to help your daughter? Do you hear yourself? A good mother would be grateful that someone noticed a problem and took action." And there it was, the final manipulation. Even in this moment, with surgical scissors poised over my newborn daughter, Rachel was trying to make me the villain for protecting my child. The door opened behind us, and Nurse Patricia walked in carrying a medication tray. Her professional smile vanished the instant she assessed the scene. Rachel holding my baby with scissors raised, me half out of bed with panic written across my face. "Ma'am," Patricia said to Rachel, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from 23 years of handling every conceivable crisis, "I need you to put the baby back in the bassinet, immediately." "I'm a nurse," Rachel said, not moving. "I was just addressing a medical issue with the identification bracelet." "You're not staff at this hospital," Patricia replied, stepping closer. "Hospital policy requires that only authorized medical personnel handle patient identification systems. Please return the infant to her bassinet." "But look at how tight this bracelet is," Rachel insisted, holding Sophia up so Patricia could see. "It's cutting off circulation. Someone needs to address this immediately." Patricia glanced at the bracelet, then at Rachel's face, then at me. In that moment, I saw her put together the same pieces I had. This was a manufactured crisis by someone with an agenda. "Ma'am, that bracelet appears to be properly fitted according to hospital standards. If you have concerns about patient care, there are appropriate channels for reporting them. This is not one of them." "So you're willing to risk this baby's safety to protect hospital protocol?" Rachel's voice was rising now, taking on the dramatic edge that meant she was building toward a full performance. But Patricia had dealt with family members who created drama to feel important, who manufactured crises to insert themselves into situations they didn't belong. Her response was swift and decisive. "Security to room 314. Non-emergency family intervention needed." Rachel's face went white. "You're calling security on me for trying to protect my niece?"
"I'm calling security because you're holding a patient's infant with a sharp instrument against the family's wishes and the hospital's protocols," Patricia said evenly. "That constitutes a safety concern." The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal clarity of a crisis. Hospital security arrived. 2 professional, calm officers who assessed the situation quickly. Rachel, still holding Sophia, tried to explain about the medical emergency she'd identified. But when the head of security, a former EMT named General Rodriguez, examined the bracelet, his assessment was immediate and definitive. "Ma'am, this bracelet is properly fitted according to standard protocols. There's no medical issue here." "But I'm a nurse," Rachel protested. "I can see that it's too tight." "Ma'am, are you currently employed by this hospital?" "No, but then you have no authority to make medical assessments or modify patient identification systems." As security gently but firmly convinced Rachel to return Sophia to her bassinet, I saw something in my sister's eyes that chilled me. It wasn't embarrassment or shame at being caught creating a false emergency. It was calculation. She was already planning her next move, already figuring out how to spend this incident to serve her narrative about my inadequacy and her necessity. "Elena, when you realize that I was trying to protect Sophia from neglect, when you understand that I was the only one willing to act when I saw a problem,
remember this moment. Remember that you chose protocol over your daughter's safety. After she left, Patricia spent 20 minutes documenting the incident. Hospital policy required detailed records when family members attempted to interfere with patient care, and Rachel's actions had crossed multiple lines. "Mrs. Sullivan," Patricia said gently as she completed her notes, "I want you to know that your daughter's bracelet was perfectly fitted. There was no medical issue. What happened here was someone creating a problem where none existed." "I know," I said, my voice shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. "But Patricia, I need you to understand something. This isn't over. My sister is going to find a way to use this incident to prove that I can't protect Sophia, that I chose hospital rules over my baby's welfare." Patricia's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Sullivan, we have security camera footage of the entire incident. We have documentation showing that the bracelet was properly fitted, and we have witness statements confirming that you responded appropriately to protect your child. If anyone tries to twist the situation, we have evidence of what really happened here." What I didn't know was that Patricia's documentation would prove crucial sooner than anyone expected. Because at that exact moment, Marcus was boarding a military transport in Qatar, having received an emergency notification through his commanding officer that his wife and newborn daughter were experiencing a family crisis requiring immediate intervention. The notification had come from someone claiming to be a close family member, reporting that Elena Sullivan was suffering from severe postpartum complications, that the baby was at risk, and that military family services should expedite General Sullivan's return to address what appeared to be a deteriorating family situation. Rachel had made one critical error in her final manipulation. She had contacted military authorities without understanding that when you notify a Marine general's command structure about threats to his family, you trigger protocols designed to protect national security assets and their dependents. Protocols that involved verification, investigation, and documentation at levels she couldn't imagine. As Patricia finished her incident report, halfway around the world, Marcus Sullivan was reading a classified briefing that detailed every contact his family had had with military and civilian authorities over the past week, including recordings, witness statements, and security footage that painted a very clear picture of what was really been happening in his absence. The revelation was about to become an avalanche, and Rachel, who thought she'd been cleverly manipulating a situation to save her sister from poor choices, was about to discover that she had been systematically targeting the family of one of the most powerful military officers in the United States Marine Corps. The man she'd dismissed as an absent husband, who put his career before his family, was about to show her exactly what happened when someone threatened what mattered most to him. And he wasn't coming alone. The call came at 4:23 p.m., exactly 3 hours and 23 minutes before Marcus was scheduled to land. I was finally getting some rest after the bracelet incident when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a long string of digits that suggested an international call. "Elena, baby, are you okay right now? Are you alone?" The question sent a chill through me. "Marcus, where are you? I thought you were in communication blackout." "I'm on a transport heading home. Elena, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you and Sophia safe right now? Are you alone?" "We're safe. We're in the hospital." "Marcus, what's wrong? You sound—" "I've been briefed on everything that's been happening. The family services calls, the CFS involvement, the incident report from this afternoon." My voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, something between fury and protective determination. "Elena, I need you to understand something about what's been going on because we're about to have some very serious conversations with some very serious people." "I don't understand. What kind of briefing?" There was a pause, filled with the background noise of aircraft engines and what sounded like other voices in the background. When Marcus spoke again, his tone had shifted to something more official, more formal. Elena, when someone contacts military family services with concerns about a service member's family, especially when that service member holds a high security clearance, it triggers certain protocols. Everything gets documented, investigated, and reported up the chain of command.
My stomach dropped. Marcus, how high up the chin are we talking? High enough that I've spent the last 6 hours in briefings with intelligence officers, family advocates, and my commanding general, reviewing every contact your sister has had with military and civilian authorities over the past week. The words hit me like ice water. Intelligence officers? Commanding general? I'd been thinking of Rachel's manipulations as family drama, but Marcus was describing something that sounded like a national security investigation. Baby, Marcus continued, his voice gentling slightly, I need you to know that you haven't done anything wrong. The investigation has made it very clear that you've been the target of systematic manipulation and false reporting. But Elena, the scope of what's been happening, it's bigger than family dysfunction. Before I could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway outside my room. Raised voices, the sound of multiple people walking with purpose, and then a knock on my door that sounded distinctly official. Mrs. Sullivan? A woman's voice called through the door. This is Colonel Janet Morrison from Peterson Air Force Base Family Services. May we come in? I looked at my phone, still connected to Marcus. There are military officers here. I know. I sent them. Elena, let them in. They're there to help and to make sure you have accurate information about what's been happening. With trembling hands, I called for them to enter. 3 people walked into my room. Colonel Morrison, a tall woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, a man in navy dress blues who introduced himself as Commander Robert Hayes from Military Intelligence, and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, whom I recognized from the previous day. Mrs. Sullivan, Colonel Morrison said, her voice professional but kind, your husband asked us to brief you on the situation that's developed regarding your family's interaction with military and civilian authorities. Is now a good time? I looked down at Sophia, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, then at my phone where Marcus was still connected. I think I need to understand what's happening. Commander Hayes opened a tablet and consulted what appeared to be an official report. Mrs. Sullivan, over the past 5 days, we've received multiple contacts regarding your family. These contacts have come from someone identifying herself as Rachel Martinez, claiming to be your sister and expressing concerns about your welfare and that of your infant daughter. She is my sister, I said weakly. Yes, we've confirmed that. However, the nature and frequency of her contacts have raised some serious concerns. Mrs. Sullivan, are you aware that your sister has contacted 3 separate military family service offices, 2 civilian family advocacy organizations, and the Colorado Department of Human Services? My mouth fell open. 3 military offices? Peterson Air Force Base, Fort Carson Family Services, and the Marine Corps Community Services at Quantico, Lieutenant Commander Chen read from her own notes. In each case, she identified herself as a concerned family member of General Marcus Sullivan and reported that his wife was experiencing severe postpartum complications that were endangering both mother and infant. General Marcus Sullivan. The words hit me like a physical blow. In 2 years of marriage, I'd somehow never fully processed that my husband wasn't just any Marine officer. He was a general. And Rachel had been systematically contacting military authorities about the family of a general. Elena? Marcus's voice crackled through the phone. Are you still there? You're a general, I said, the words coming out in a whisper. There was a pause. Baby, I thought you knew. I thought... Elena, didn't you understand what my rank meant? The truth is, I'd known he was high-ranking. I'd known he was important. But I'd been so focused on the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who brought me coffee in bed and sang off-key in the shower and cried when I told him I was pregnant, that I'd never fully grasped the institutional weight of his position. Commander Hayes cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Sullivan, your husband is a 2-star general in the United States Marine Corps, currently serving as Deputy Director of Operations for Central Command. When someone makes repeated reports about the welfare of his family, especially reports that suggest potential security vulnerabilities or personal crises that could affect his operational effectiveness, it becomes a matter of national security interest. I was feeling like I was drowning. National security interest? Elena, Marcus's voice came through the phone, urgent and gentle. Breathe, just breathe. You haven't done anything wrong, but I need you to understand why there are going to be consequences for what Rachel has been doing. Colonel Morrison leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Sullivan, filing false reports about military families is a federal crime. But more importantly, your sister's actions have triggered security protocols that have required significant resources to investigate and resolve. We've had to divert intelligence assets, conduct background checks, and implement family protection measures based on what we now know were fabricated concerns. Protection measures? I asked. Mrs. Sullivan, Lieutenant Commander Chin explained, when reports suggest that a general's family is in crisis, we have to consider whether that family might be vulnerable to exploitation, coercion, or other security threats. Your home has been under discreet surveillance for the past 3 days. Your sister's activities have been monitored and documented, and your husband's deployment had to be adjusted to address what appeared to be a family emergency. The room was spinning. Adjusted how? Marcus's voice came through the phone with a weight I was beginning to understand. Elena, I was pulled out of a critical operation 6 hours early. That required repositioning assets, briefing replacement command staff, and implementing contingency plans that had been held in reserve. The cost of that adjustment in both resources and operational security is significant. Oh my God, I whispered.
Commander Hayes consulted his tablet again. Mrs. Sullivan, we need to ask you some questions about your sister's behavior and motivations. Based on the pattern of her contacts and the escalating nature of her reports, we need to determine whether her actions were motivated by genuine concern, mental health issues, or potentially more serious intentions. More serious intentions? The words came out in a croak. Mrs. Sullivan, Colonel Morrison said gently, when someone systematically targets a military family with false reports, we have to consider whether they might be attempting to compromise a service member's security clearance, create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile actors, or simply cause enough disruption to affect operational effectiveness. I thought about Rachel's documentation, her calls to government agencies, her manufactured crisis with the hospital bracelet. What I'd seen as sisterly manipulation, the military was evaluating as potential security threats. She's not a spy, I said weakly. She's controlling. She's always been controlling. We believe that, Colonel Morrison assured me. Our investigation suggests that her motivations are personal rather than adversarial. But Mrs. Sullivan, the impact of her actions goes far beyond family drama, when the target is someone in your husband's position. My phone crackled again. Elena, I need you to know that when I land in 2 hours, I'm not coming alone. There are going to be some very serious conversations with Rachel about the consequences of what she's been doing. And depending on what those conversations reveal, there may be legal consequences. Legal consequences? Commander Hayes nodded grimly. Mrs. Sullivan, filing false reports with federal agencies is a crime. Interfering with military operations is a crime. Attempting to manipulate security protocols through deception is a crime. Your sister may have committed multiple felonies without realizing it. As the officers continued their briefing, detailing the scope of the investigation Rachel had unwittingly triggered, I realized that my sister's need to control my life had escalated far beyond anything I could have imagined. She hadn't just been trying to prove I was an unfit mother. She'd been systematically attacking the family of a United States Marine Corps general, using federal resources and military protocols as weapons in her personal campaign to reshape my life. And in less than 2 hours, she was going to meet the man she'd dismissed as an absent husband who put his career before his family. Except he wasn't coming as my husband, Marcus, the man who sang lullabies and brought me flowers. He was coming as General Marcus Sullivan, backed by the full authority of the United States Marine Corps, with documented evidence of everything she'd done and the federal crimes she may have committed in the process. Rachel had spent a week trying to prove that my husband wasn't suitable for our family. She was about to discover exactly who my husband really was. Rachel returned to the hospital at 6:15 p.m. with what she clearly believed was her trump card, a family attorney named David Brennan who specialized in custody cases, and a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Angela Foster, who'd agreed to conduct an emergency evaluation of my fitness as a mother. I watched through my hospital room window as they crossed the parking lot, Rachel walking with the confident stride of someone who believed she was about to save the day, the attorney checking his phone, and Dr. Foster carrying what appeared to be official assessment forms. They had no idea that at that exact moment, Marcus was 40 minutes out from Denver International Airport, accompanied by a military intelligence team and enough federal authority to turn Rachel's life upside down. "Elena," Rachel announced as she swept into my room without knocking, "I've brought some people who can help us resolve this situation properly." Behind her, David Brennan extended his hand with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm David Brennan. Your sister has retained my services to ensure that your daughter's welfare is properly protected during this difficult transition period." Dr. Foster stepped forward with the clinical bearing of someone accustomed to making life-changing assessments. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you've been experiencing some challenges with postpartum adjustment. I'm here to conduct a brief evaluation to determine what support services might be beneficial for you and your family." I stared at them, processing the audacity of what Rachel had orchestrated. While I'd been receiving briefings from military intelligence about federal crimes and national security protocols, my sister had been assembling her own team of professionals to prove I was an unfit mother. "Rachel," I said carefully, "what exactly do you think is happening here?" "What's happening," she replied, settling into the visitor's chair like she was chairing a board meeting, "is that I'm ensuring Sophia gets the protection she deserves. Elena, you've been resistant to family support, you've rejected professional intervention, and this afternoon you became hostile when I tried to address a medical emergency with Sophia's hospital bracelet." David Brennan was already taking notes. "Mrs. Sullivan, your sister has documented several concerning incidents over the past week: postpartum emotional instability, rejection of family support, and most concerning, an apparent inability to recognize when your infant was in medical distress." "Medical distress?" I repeated. Dr. Foster consulted her clipboard. "Your sister reported that you became agitated and threatening when she attempted to address what appeared to be circulation problems caused by an improperly fitted hospital identification bracelet. She indicates that you prioritized hospital protocol over your daughter's immediate physical welfare." The rewriting of events was so complete, so calculated, that I almost admired the manipulation. Rachel had taken her manufactured crisis and transformed it into evidence of my inadequacy, complete with professional witnesses who would testify to her version of events. "Dr. Foster," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "did my sister mention that her medical intervention was stopped by hospital security, or that the nursing staff documented that there was no medical emergency?"
Rachel's expression didn't change. "Elena? You're doing it again. You're more concerned with defending yourself than acknowledging the real issues here." "What real issues?" I asked. David Brennan leaned forward with the earnest expression of someone delivering difficult news. "Mrs. Sullivan, your sister is concerned that your husband's military obligations make him unavailable for the kind of consistent co-parenting that an infant requires. She's also concerned that your recent behavior suggests you may not be recognizing when you need help or when your daughter needs intervention." "And what exactly are you proposing?" Rachel finally looked directly at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Not concern or love, but the satisfied determination of someone who believed she was about to win a game she'd been playing for years. "I'm proposing that Sophia come home with me and Kevin temporarily," she said, "just until you're fully recovered and Marcus can arrange for more stable support. Dr. Foster can continue her evaluation in a less stressful environment, and you can focus on healing without the pressure of caring for a newborn alone." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. My sister was proposing to take my 3-day-old daughter, and she'd brought professional backup to make it sound reasonable. "Absolutely not," I said, my voice carrying an authority that surprised all of us. "Elena," Dr. Foster said gently, "sometimes new mothers need temporary support arrangements while they adjust to the demands of infant care. This wouldn't be permanent, just a brief intervention to ensure everyone's well-being." "Based on what assessment?" I asked. "You've been in this room for 5 minutes." "Based on documented concerns about your recognition of medical emergencies, your rejection of family support, and your apparent hostility toward professional intervention," David Brennan replied, consulting his notes. "Mrs. Martinez has provided detailed documentation of multiple incidents that suggest—" He stopped mid-sentence as voices erupted in the hallway outside my room. Authoritative voices, multiple conversations happening simultaneously, and the unmistakable sound of people moving with military precision. The door opened, and Nurse Patricia entered with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of professional protocol and barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said formally, "your husband has arrived with several colleagues who need to speak with you. Should I ask your current visitors to wait in the family lounge?" Before I could answer, Marcus appeared in the doorway, and the sight of him in full dress uniform, ribbons, medals, and insignia that suddenly looked far more impressive than I had ever noticed, made the entire room go silent. But it wasn't just Marcus. Behind him stood Colonel Morrison, Commander Hayes, and 2 men I didn't recognize wearing suits that screamed federal authority. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice warm as he crossed to my bedside, but his eyes were assessing everyone in the room with clinical precision. "How are you feeling, baby?" He leaned down to kiss my forehead, then turned to look at Sophia in her bassinet. When he straightened, his entire demeanor had shifted to something I'd never seen before. Not my gentle husband, but a Marine Corps general who'd been informed that his family had been targeted. "You must be Rachel," he said, turning to my sister with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've heard so much about you." Rachel, to her credit, recovered quickly from her obvious shock at Marcus's appearance. "Marcus, I'm so glad you're here. We've been very concerned about Elena and Sophia." "Have you?" Marcus asked mildly. "That's interesting, because I've been receiving some very detailed reports about your concerns. In fact, I've spent the last 8 hours being briefed on every contact you've made with military and civilian authorities regarding my family." David Brennan cleared his throat. "General Sullivan, I'm David Brennan, retained by Mrs. Martinez to ensure proper protection for your daughter during what appears to be a challenging family situation." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Special Agent Richard Torres, FBI. I need to inform you that your client is currently under federal investigation for filing false reports with Military Family Services, interfering with military operations, and potentially violating several statutes related to national security." The room went dead silent. Dr. Foster's clipboard slipped from her hands. David Brennan's face went white, and Rachel looked like she'd been struck by lightning. "Federal investigation?" she whispered. Commander Hayes opened his tablet. "Mrs. Martinez, over the past 5 days, you've contacted 3 military family service offices, filed reports with 2 civilian agencies, and made statements to federal authorities about the welfare of a Marine Corps general's family. These actions have triggered security protocols, diverted intelligence resources, and required the early termination of a classified military operation." "I was trying to help," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Martinez, you've potentially committed multiple federal crimes. Making false statements to federal agencies, interfering with military operations, and filing fraudulent reports are serious offenses that carry significant penalties."
Marcus moved closer to Rachel, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command that made grown Marines snap to attention. Rachel, you called my wife an unfit mother. You tried to take my newborn daughter out of her mother's arms with surgical scissors. You contacted federal authorities and told them my family was in crisis. His voice remained calm, controlled, but there was steel underneath that made everyone in the room understand that they were in the presence of someone accustomed to wielding serious power. You attempted to interfere with my family, my career, and my ability to serve my country based on your personal belief that you knew better than me, my wife, and every medical professional who's evaluated our situation. Rachel was shaking now, the reality of what she had done finally penetrating her certainty that she'd been helping. I never meant. I didn't know.
You didn't know what? Marcus asked. You didn't know that filing false reports with the government has consequences? You didn't know that manipulating federal agencies requires those agencies to investigate? You didn't know that targeting a military family triggers security protocols? Colonel Morrison stepped forward. Mrs. Martinez, we need you to come with us for questioning. Mr. Brennan, Dr. Foster, you're welcome to contact us if you have questions about your client's legal situation, but this interview is concluded. As federal agents and military officers began the process of escorting Rachel and her team out of my hospital room, I realized that my sister's campaign to save me from my choices had resulted in her being arrested by the FBI, while my husband, the man she'd dismissed as an absent, unsuitable father, had arrived with enough federal authority to dismantle her life. The woman who'd spent a week documenting my every vulnerable moment was about to experience her own very thorough documentation by the United States government. And Marcus, the husband she'd claimed would never prioritize his family, had just demonstrated exactly what happened when someone threatened what mattered most to him. The federal courthouse in Denver was nothing like I'd expected for what would become the final chapter of Rachel's campaign to control my life. It was 8:30 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Sophia's birth, and I was sitting in the witness section watching my sister face the consequences of systematically targeting a Marine general's family. But this wasn't the dramatic courtroom showdown you see in movies. This was a federal plea hearing, where Rachel would formally acknowledge the crimes she'd committed and accept responsibility for actions that had cost the government hundreds of thousands of dollars in wasted resources and compromised military operations. Elena, Marcus said quietly, adjusting Sophia in her carrier as we waited for proceedings to begin, you don't have to be here for this. Yes, I do, I replied, watching Rachel sit at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting gray suit, flanked by a federal public defender who'd clearly explained that fighting the charges would be futile given the documentation the government possessed. Over the past 6 weeks, as I'd recovered from surgery and learned to navigate life as a new mother, the scope of what Rachel had done and what it had cost had become staggeringly clear. The FBI investigation had revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond sisterly concern and crossed into territory that federal prosecutors considered a textbook case of interference with military operations. Special Agent Torres had briefed us on the findings 3 weeks earlier. Rachel's calls hadn't just triggered family services investigations, they'd prompted background checks on Marcus that reached levels requiring congressional notification. Her claims about my mental state had triggered protocols designed to assess whether the family of a senior military officer might be vulnerable to foreign exploitation. Her documentation of my inadequacies had been forwarded to counterintelligence units who'd spent valuable time and resources determining whether I might be a security risk. Mrs. Sullivan, Agent Torres had explained, your sister's actions required us to investigate whether your family was experiencing genuine crisis, whether you might be vulnerable to coercion, whether General Sullivan's judgment might be compromised by family stress, and whether the reports themselves might be part of a foreign influence operation designed to target senior military leaders. The cost analysis alone was staggering. 47 federal agents across multiple agencies had been assigned to investigate Rachel's reports. Marcus's early return from deployment had cost the military over $2 million in operational adjustments and replacement staffing.
The security assessments and background investigations had consumed hundreds of hours of classified intelligence resources. All because my sister believed she knew better than everyone else what my life should look like. Judge Patricia Walsh entered the courtroom with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd spent 15 years on the federal bench and had no patience for cases involving the waste of government resources. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she'd seen every type of defendant imaginable. "Good morning," she said, settling behind the bench and reviewing the case file. "We're here for the plea hearing in United States versus Rachel Angela Martinez. Is the defendant present and ready to proceed?" Rachel's attorney, a young man named Michael Chen, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Martinez is present and prepared to enter her plea." Judge Walsh looked directly at Rachel. "Ms. Martinez, you're charged with 3 counts of making false statements to federal agencies, 2 counts of interfering with military operations, and 1 count of filing fraudulent reports. Do you understand these charges?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice barely audible. "And you've had adequate time to discuss these charges with your attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Walsh consulted the case file, and her expression suggested she'd found something particularly irritating. "Ms. Martinez, I've reviewed the government's evidence in this case, and I have to say, this is one of the most comprehensive examples of systematic false reporting I've encountered. The documentation of your contacts with military and civilian agencies is extensive, and the impact of your actions on federal resources is significant." She looked up from the file. "Before we proceed with your plea, I want to make sure you understand what you've actually done here. This wasn't a case of making a single mistake or filing one inaccurate report. This was a week-long campaign of contacting federal agencies with fabricated concerns about a military family, resulting in the waste of substantial government resources and the disruption of military operations." Rachel's attorney leaned over to whisper something to her, but Judge Walsh continued. "Ms. Martinez, the government has provided me with recordings of your calls to military family services. I've listened to them. You didn't express general concern about your sister's welfare. You made specific, detailed claims about postpartum complications that didn't exist, about an infant in medical danger who was perfectly healthy, and about a family in crisis that was functioning normally." The judge's voice grew sharper. "You claimed that Mrs. Sullivan was experiencing severe postpartum depression that was endangering her child. You stated that General Sullivan's deployment had left his family without adequate support. You suggested that the infant was not receiving proper medical care. None of these statements were true." I felt Marcus's hand find mine as Judge Walsh laid out the full scope of Rachel's lies. Hearing them recited in open court, with their legal implications spelled out clearly, drove home just how calculating and systematic her manipulation had been. "Furthermore," Judge Walsh continued, "your actions prompted security protocols that required intelligence agencies to assess whether General Sullivan's family might be vulnerable to foreign exploitation. Do you understand what that means, Ms. Martinez?" Rachel shook her head slightly. "It means that highly trained federal agents had to investigate whether your sister might be a security risk to the United States military. It means that classified resources were diverted from genuine national security concerns to investigate fabricated family drama. It means that military operations were disrupted based on false information that you provided to federal authorities." The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Morrison, stood up. "Your Honor, the government would like to emphasize that this case represents more than just false reporting. Ms. Martinez's actions demonstrate a pattern of manipulation that targeted one of our nation's senior military officers and his family during a critical deployment period." She opened a file and consulted her notes. The investigation revealed that Ms. Martinez documented private family conversations, photographed confidential military communications she observed in the defendant's home, and maintained detailed logs of General Sullivan's family activities over a period of several months. That was news to me. I looked at Marcus, who squeezed my hand but kept his expression neutral. We'd known about the documentation from the hospital, but this suggested Rachel's surveillance of our life had been going on much longer than we'd realized. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Walsh said, "is this accurate? Were you documenting General Sullivan's family activities prior to your sister's hospitalization?" Rachel's attorney stood up. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges that she maintained records of family interactions out of concern for her sister's welfare." "For how long?" the judge asked. "Approximately 8 months, Your Honor." 8 months. Rachel had been building a case against my fitness as a wife and mother since before I'd even gotten pregnant. She'd been documenting Marcus's deployment schedule, my emotional responses to his absences, and our private family moments as evidence for some future intervention. Judge Walsh's expression darkened. "Ms. Martinez, you've been conducting surveillance on a Marine general and his family for 8 months, collecting information that you then used to file false reports with federal agencies. Do you understand how seriously the government takes this kind of activity?" Rachel was crying now, quiet tears that suggested she was finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of what she'd done. "Your Honor," her attorney said, "my client's actions were motivated by genuine concern for her sister and niece. She believed she was protecting her family." "Mr. Chen, your client's motivations don't change the fact that she systematically lied to federal agents, wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars in government resources, and compromised military operations. Concern for family doesn't excuse criminal behavior." The judge turned back to Rachel. "Ms. Martinez, how do you plead to the charges against you?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Rachel whispered. Judge Walsh made notes on the case file. "Ms. Martinez, under the terms of your plea agreement, you'll serve 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You'll also pay $347,000 in restitution to cover the cost of the investigation your false reports triggered." The numbers hit me like a physical blow. 18 months in prison, nearly $350,000 in restitution. Rachel's attempt to save me from my choices had destroyed her own life completely. "Additionally," Judge Walsh continued, "you're prohibited from any contact with General Sullivan's family for the duration of your probation. This includes direct contact, indirect contact through third parties, and any form of surveillance or documentation of their activities." She looked directly at Rachel. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to understand something. Your actions didn't just waste government resources. They targeted a Marine family during wartime, potentially compromising national security for personal reasons. That's not concern for family. That's selfishness taken to criminal extremes." As court officers prepared to escort Rachel to begin her sentence, she turned toward me with an expression I'd never seen before, complete defeat mixed with something that might have been genuine remorse. "Elena," she said, her voice breaking, "I really thought I was helping. I really believed you needed protection." For a moment, I felt the old familiar urge to comfort her, to minimize her pain and tell her everything would be okay. But then I looked down at Sophia, sleeping peacefully in her carrier, and thought about the 18 hours of labor I'd endured alone while Rachel was secretly documenting my vulnerability for future use against me. "Rachel," I said quietly, "helping would have been bringing dinner, doing laundry, and telling me I was doing a good job. What you did was build a case against my family because you couldn't accept that my life turned out differently than you planned." As the court officers led Rachel away to begin her federal prison sentence, I realized that my sister's ultimate attempt to prove I couldn't make good decisions had resulted in the most decisive vindication possible. A federal judge had just spent an hour detailing exactly how wrong Rachel had been about everything: my marriage, my motherhood, my husband's priorities, and my ability to build a life worth protecting.
The woman who'd cut my newborn's hospital bracelet, claiming medical necessity, was now a convicted felon who'd be spending the next year and a half in federal prison for her systematic campaign against my family. And I was going home with my husband, the Marine general who'd moved heaven and earth to protect us, and our daughter, who would grow up knowing that when someone threatens what's precious, there are people with the power and the will to make sure there are consequences. 1 year later, I was standing in the kitchen of our new home on base at Camp Pendleton, watching Marcus teach 10-month-old Sophia how to clap her hands, while military spouses from his unit helped me prepare for our first major social event as a general's family. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was voluntarily surrounding myself with the kind of support system Rachel had tried to force on me, except this time it was my choice, built on respect rather than manipulation. "Elena, this potato salad is incredible," said Colonel Jennifer Martinez, no relation to my former sister, despite the shared surname, as she sampled the recipe I'd adapted from my grandmother's notes. "You have to give me this recipe for the next family barbecue." I smiled, feeling the easy camaraderie that had developed among the military spouses who'd welcomed me into their community. These women understood the challenges of military life without treating them as character flaws in their husbands. They celebrated promotions, supported each other through deployments, and created networks of mutual aid that functioned like extended family, except healthier than the one I'd been born into. "Of course," I said, adding the finishing touches to what had become my signature contribution to base events. "Though, I should warn you, it's become Marcus's favorite, so you might have a 2-star general asking you for the recipe at the next command meeting." The women laughed, and I felt that familiar warmth of belonging somewhere because of who I was, not despite who I was. It had taken Rachel's federal conviction for me to understand the difference. Major Sarah Chen, Lieutenant Commander Chen's sister-in-law, as it turned out, bounced her own toddler on her hip while helping arrange flowers. "Elena, can I ask you something personal? How did you handle the transition to military spouse life? I mean, with everything that happened during your first few weeks?" The question would have sent me into panic mode a year ago. Now I considered it thoughtfully while checking on the dessert I'd prepared for tonight's reception, honoring Marcus's promotion to 3-star general. I learned that there's a difference between people who want to help you succeed and people who want to control your success, I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. Military spouse life has challenges, but they're manageable when you're surrounded by people who respect your choices instead of trying to remake them. Through the kitchen window, I could see Marcus in the backyard with several other officers, Sophia crawling between their feet, while they discussed logistics for the evening's event. He caught my eye and winked, that same gesture that had made me fall in love with him, but now I understood the full weight of the man behind it. Marcus Sullivan wasn't just my husband who happened to be in the military. He was Lieutenant General Marcus Sullivan, Deputy Commander of U.S. Pacific Command, a man whose decisions affected thousands of service members and whose strategic thinking influenced American military policy across half the globe. Rachel had seen his rank as evidence that he'd never prioritized family. The truth was that his position gave him resources and authority that most husbands could never provide to protect what mattered most to him. "Elena, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the base family services director, and yes, another Martinez, approached with a clipboard and the expression of someone about to make an important request. "I know this might be presumptuous, but would you consider joining our family advocacy program? We've had several military spouses ask specifically for support from someone who's dealt with complicated family dynamics." I paused in my food preparation. Over the past year, I'd heard whispers about other military families dealing with interference from relatives who didn't understand or respect military life. Mothers-in-law who filed complaints about their daughters-in-law being abandoned during deployments. Siblings who contacted commanding officers to report concerns about service members' family priorities. Extended family members who saw military spouse challenges as evidence that their loved ones had made poor life choices. "What kind of support?" I asked. "Advocacy mostly. Help navigating when family members contact military authorities with unfounded concerns. Assistance understanding legal protections for military families. Sometimes just being someone who can say,
I've been there, and here's how you protect yourself and your family. The request was both flattering and terrifying. A year ago, I would have declined immediately, convinced I wasn't qualified to help anyone else when I'd barely managed to help myself. But that woman, the one who had apologized for existing and shrunk herself to avoid conflict, didn't exist anymore. I'd like to think about it, I said honestly. Maybe start with 1 or 2 cases and see how it goes. Dr. Martinez smiled. Take your time, but Elena, what you went through and how you handled it could be incredibly valuable for other military families dealing with similar situations.
As the afternoon progressed and more families arrived for the evening's celebration, I found myself observing the dynamics with new eyes. Military spouses were remarkably resilient, but they were also vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation Rachel had perfected. The demands of military life created stress points that could be exploited by family members who framed interference as concern and control as protection. But I also saw something Rachel had never understood. Military families weren't weak or abandoned. They were strong, connected, and protected by systems designed to support service members and their families through challenges that civilian families rarely faced. Mom! The word came from Captain Lisa Brennan, who was chasing her 3-year-old son around our backyard. Tommy, come back here! I watched her husband, Major David Brennan, scoop up their son with practice ease while balancing his phone conversation about base security preparations. They moved together with the kind of partnership that comes from navigating real challenges as a team, supporting each other's responsibilities rather than competing with them. Elena, you've created something beautiful here, said Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, the base chaplain's wife and a 70-year-old woman who'd been part of military communities for over 4 decades. This feels like family. She was right. The backyard full of military families, children playing between conversations about deployments and promotions, spouses sharing recipes and resources, it did feel like family. Not the biological family that had tried to tear me down, but the chosen family that had formed around shared values and mutual respect. Mrs. Walsh, I said, refilling her iced tea, can I ask you something? In all your years in military communities, have you seen other families deal with the kind of interference we experienced? Her expression grew serious. Oh, honey, more than you might imagine. Military life is hard enough without family members who think they know better than the people actually living it. I've seen parents try to convince their children to leave the military, siblings who call commanders to report problems that don't exist, and in-laws who treat deployments like abandonment rather than service. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. But Elena, what makes your situation unusual isn't what your sister did. Unfortunately, that kind of interference happens more often than it should. What's unusual is how it was handled. Most military families don't have the resources or authority to address systematic false reporting the way your husband could. The observation was sobering. I'd been so focused on our specific situation that I hadn't considered how other military families might handle similar challenges without access to the level of institutional protection Marcus's rank provided. That's part of why Dr. Martinez wants you to consider the advocacy program. Your experience could help other families understand their options and protect themselves before things escalate to federal crimes. As evening approached and the reception began in earnest, I watched Marcus move through the crowd of fellow officers, their spouses, and senior enlisted personnel. This was his element, not because he loved the politics or ceremony, but because he understood that leadership meant caring for the people under his command and their families. Ladies and gentlemen, General Patricia Morrison, Marcus's commanding officer and the first woman to hold her position, called for attention as the sun set over the Pacific. We're here tonight to celebrate Lieutenant General Sullivan's promotion and his continued service to our nation. The crowd quieted, and I felt Sophia settle more comfortably in my arms as she observed the ceremony with the solemn attention that babies sometimes bring to important moments. But more than celebrating rank, General Morrison continued, we're celebrating the kind of leader who understands that military families are the foundation of military strength. General Sullivan's commitment to both mission and family exemplifies the values we strive to embody as service members and as human beings. She looked directly at Marcus. Your willingness to protect your family, and by extension, all military families from those who would exploit our service for their own purposes, reflects the integrity we expect from our senior leadership. The applause was warm, genuine, and I realized that Rachel's actions had inadvertently elevated Marcus's reputation within the military community. His response to threats against his family had demonstrated exactly the kind of protective leadership that senior military officials valued in their commanders. After the formal portion of the evening ended and guests began to mingle more freely, I found myself standing near the edge of our property, looking out at the ocean while Sophia dozed in her carrier. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Sullivan," Marcus said, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of wine. I was thinking about how different everything is now. A year ago, I was recovering from surgery, doubting my ability to be a good mother, and apologizing for taking up space in my own life. And now? I considered the question seriously. Now I'm hosting reception parties for 3-star generals, considering joining a family advocacy program, and raising a daughter who will grow up knowing that when someone threatens her family, there are consequences. Marcus smiled. That's quite a transformation. It is. But Marcus, the transformation wasn't really about what happened with Rachel. It was about finally understanding that I deserve to be protected, respected, and celebrated, instead of managed, controlled, and diminished. I shifted Sophia to my other arm, marveling at how natural the movement had become. Rachel spent so much energy trying to convince everyone that I was making poor choices, that I was weak, that I needed her guidance to navigate life successfully. And what do you think now? I think I made excellent choices. I chose a career helping children. I chose a husband who would move heaven and earth to protect our family. I chose to build a life based on service, honor, and mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. I looked out at the ocean, where military ships were visible in the distance, part of the Pacific Fleet that Marcus helped command. I chose to be part of something bigger than myself, bigger than my family of origin, bigger than the small world Rachel wanted to keep me in. Marcus put his arm around me, careful not to disturb Sophia. And what about Rachel? Do you ever think about her? It was a question I'd been expecting. Rachel had been released from federal prison 3 months ago and was living in a halfway house in Denver, working in a data entry job while completing her probation requirements. Our mother had mentioned her occasionally in the brief, careful phone calls we'd started having again, conversations that focused entirely on Sophia and avoided any discussion of Rachel's situation or our family's past dynamics. I think about her sometimes, I said honestly. I hope she's learning something from the consequences of her actions. I hope she's developing healthier ways to care about people. But, Marcus, I don't think about her the way I used to. How did you used to think about her? Like she was an inevitable force I had to manage, someone whose approval I needed to feel good about my choices. Now I think about her like what she actually is, someone who made really poor decisions that had serious consequences, and someone I don't have to have in my life if her presence isn't healthy for my family. Sophia stirred in her carrier, making the soft sounds that meant she was waking up from her nap. I looked down at my daughter, who would grow up in a world where her parents' love for each other was never questioned, where her father's dedication to both family and service was celebrated, and where the adults in her life supported her growth rather than trying to control her path. You know what I realized? I said to Marcus as Sophia opened her eyes and smiled at the sound of my voice. Rachel was wrong about everything. She was wrong about you, wrong about our marriage, wrong about my ability to be a good mother, and wrong about what kind of support I needed. And what kind of support did you actually need?
I looked around at our backyard, still filled with military families who'd become genuine friends, at the life we'd built together, at the community that had embraced us not despite our challenges, but because of how we'd handled them. I needed people who believed in my strength instead of focusing on my vulnerabilities. I needed a partner who saw my worth instead of my weaknesses. I needed a community that celebrated my choices instead of questioning them. I shifted Sophia to face outward so she could see the evening celebration continuing around us. As we rejoined the reception, I realized that Rachel's attempt to save me from my choices had actually saved me, not from Marcus or military life or the challenges of being a new mother, but from a lifetime of believing that other people's opinions about my life mattered more than my own experience of living it. The woman who'd been too weak to defend herself from a hospital bracelet manipulation was gone. In her place stood Elena Sullivan, military spouse, mother, and advocate for other families who deserved the same protection and respect she'd fought to claim. And that transformation, from victim to victor, from diminished to empowered, from controlled to commanding her own life, was worth every difficult moment it had taken to achieve. 3 years after the hospital bracelet incident, I was sitting in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before the House Armed Services Committee about legislation designed to protect military families from the kind of systematic harassment that had nearly destroyed my early days as a mother. The irony that Rachel's criminal behavior had led to federal policy changes wasn't lost on me. Her attempt to tear down my family had inadvertently strengthened protections for thousands of military families across the country. Mrs. Sullivan, Congresswoman Maria Santos said, as she reviewed her notes, "Your testimony today will help us understand how existing gaps in federal law can be exploited to target military families. Are you ready to proceed?" I adjusted my navy blue suit, the same color I'd worn to Rachel's sentencing 3 years ago, but tailored differently now, with the confidence of someone who'd learned to dress for the room she deserved to be in rather than the room she was trying to survive. "Yes, Congresswoman, I'm ready." Beside me, Marcus sat in his dress uniform, now bearing the 4 stars of a full general, recently appointed as the youngest Marine Corps commandant in 50 years. His presence wasn't just supportive, it was strategic. Military leadership had realized that my experience represented a vulnerability in how the armed forces protected their personnel and their families from domestic threats disguised as concern. "Elena Sullivan has become something of a case study," Colonel Rebecca Martinez had explained when she'd first approached me about testifying. "What happened to your family revealed how sophisticated manipulation tactics could exploit military family support systems for personal agendas. Congress needs to understand both the tactics and the solutions." The hearing room was filled with military family advocates, congressional staffers, and representatives from various veterans organizations. But it was the presence of other military spouses in the gallery that steadied my nerves. Women and men who'd faced their own versions of family interference and were fighting for legal protections that would prevent others from enduring what we'd experienced. "Mrs. Sullivan," Congressman David Chen began, "can you describe for the committee the pattern of behavior that characterized your sister's interference with your family?"
I'd rehearsed this moment, but sitting under the bright lights of a congressional hearing room, speaking into microphones that would carry my words into the official record, felt surreal. 3 years ago, I'd been afraid to contradict Rachel in front of 40 wedding guests. Now I was testifying before Congress about the need to criminalize the exact tactics she'd used against me. "Congressman, my sister's interference followed a specific pattern that I now recognize as systematic harassment disguised as family concern. She documented private family interactions without consent, contacted multiple federal agencies with fabricated reports about our welfare, and attempted to manipulate official government responses to create crises that would justify her intervention in our lives." I paused, looking out at the faces in the hearing room. What made her tactics particularly dangerous was that they exploited the very systems designed to protect military families. She weaponized family services, child welfare agencies, and military support structures to validate her personal belief that my life choices were wrong. Congresswoman Santos leaned forward. Mrs. Sullivan, what specific legislative changes would have prevented or addressed your situation more effectively? This was the heart of why I was here. Over the past 3 years, working with military family advocates and legal experts, we'd identified specific gaps in federal law that allowed people like Rachel to exploit government resources for personal vendettas. 3 key changes, Congresswoman. First, we need clear federal penalties for filing false reports about military families with the specific intent to interfere with service member operations or family stability. Currently, such behavior falls under general false reporting statutes that don't address the unique vulnerabilities of military families. I consulted my notes, grateful for the months of preparation that had gone into this moment. Second, we need mandatory verification protocols for family services contacts. When someone reports concerns about a military family, there should be requirements to corroborate claims with multiple sources before triggering security protocols or operational adjustments. And the third change? Legal protection for military families who are targets of systematic harassment. Currently, families like mine have limited recourse when relatives use government agencies as weapons. We need specific statutes that recognize this form of domestic abuse and provide both legal remedies and protective measures. Congressman Michael Torres, no relation to the FBI agent who'd investigated Rachel, asked the question I'd been dreading. Mrs. Sullivan, critics might argue that these protections could discourage legitimate family members from reporting genuine concerns about military families. How do we balance protection from harassment with accountability for actual problems? It was a fair question, and one that had kept me awake during many nights of preparation. Congressman, the key is intent and pattern. Legitimate family concerns are typically expressed through appropriate channels, with willingness to accept professional assessments, and with respect for the family's autonomy. Harassment, by contrast, involves repeated contacts despite being told to stop, refusal to accept official determinations that no problems exist, and escalating tactics designed to force compliance rather than address genuine issues. I thought about the distinction between my mother's recent, careful re-entry into our lives, respectful, boundaried, focused on building relationship rather than asserting control, and Rachel's systematic campaign 3 years ago. The legislation we're proposing includes safeguards to ensure that genuine family concerns can still be reported and investigated, but it also creates consequences for people who exploit government resources to wage personal campaigns against military families. General Patricia Morrison, now serving as Deputy Commandant for Personnel, stepped forward to provide the military's perspective. Congresswoman Santos, if I may add to Mrs. Sullivan's testimony, the Department of Defense has conducted extensive analysis of the resource costs associated with false family crisis reports. In fiscal year 2023 alone, we identified 47 cases similar to the Sullivan family situation, resulting in over $12 million in wasted resources and significant operational disruptions. The numbers were staggering, and I saw several committee members take notes as General Morrison continued. These cases represent a form of domestic terrorism targeting military families and operations. The Sullivan case was unique in that General Sullivan's rank provided access to resources that allowed comprehensive documentation and prosecution. Most military families don't have those protections. Congressman Torres asked the follow-up question that cut to the heart of the issue. General Morrison, are you saying that lower-ranking service members are more vulnerable to this kind of harassment? Exactly, Congressman. A staff sergeant whose relative files false reports about family crisis doesn't have access to the security protocols and legal resources that protected the Sullivan family. They're more likely to face career damage, family separation, and personal trauma without adequate recourse. The hearing continued for 3 more hours, with testimony from other military families who'd faced similar harassment.
legal experts who'd researched the gaps in current law, and advocates who'd worked with victims of domestic manipulation. Each story reinforced the same themes: sophisticated abusers who understood how to exploit government systems, victims who were disbelieved when they reported the harassment, and inadequate legal remedies for behavior that fell between traditional domestic abuse and criminal fraud. During a brief recess, I stepped outside the hearing room to find Marcus waiting with Sophia. Now a precocious 3-year-old had been spending the day with the Congressional Child Care Services. "Mommy!" She ran to me with the uninhibited joy that still made my heart melt. "Did you tell the important people about the mean lady who tried to take me away?" Sophia's understanding of what had happened was age-appropriate but accurate. We'd explained that sometimes family members make bad choices that hurt other people, and that sometimes those choices have consequences that involve judges and police officers. We'd also explained that her daddy's job included protecting families like ours from people who make those bad choices. "Yes, sweetheart." I told them how important it is to protect families from people who don't respect boundaries. Marcus lifted Sophia so she could see over the crowd of congressional staffers and advocates filling the hallway. "How did it feel?" he asked me quietly.
Powerful, I said, surprising myself with the honesty of the answer. 3 years ago, I couldn't defend myself from Rachel's manipulation in a hospital room. Today, I testified before Congress about policy changes that could protect thousands of families from the same tactics.
"And Rachel?"
It was a question he asked periodically, not because he was concerned about her welfare, but because he understood that my healing process involved periodic assessment of how I felt about the woman who'd tried to destroy our family. I hope she's learned something from the consequences of her actions. But Marcus, I don't think about her the way I used to. She's not a factor in our lives anymore. She's just someone who made really poor choices that led to really serious consequences. Sophia squirmed to be put down and immediately went to greet some of the other military children who were waiting for their parents to finish testifying. Watching her interact with confidence and joy, secure in her knowledge that her family would protect her and that her parents' choices had created a safe, stable world for her to grow up in, I felt the final piece of healing click into place. "Elena," a familiar voice called from across the hallway. I turned to see Dr. Angela Foster, the same psychologist Rachel had brought to the hospital 3 years ago to assess my fitness as a mother. "Dr. Foster," I said, genuinely surprised to see her. "I've been following your advocacy work," she said, approaching with what appeared to be genuine respect. "I owe you an apology. When your sister brought me to evaluate you, I allowed myself to be manipulated into believing there was a legitimate family crisis. I should have asked more questions and done my own assessment before accepting her narrative." The apology was unexpected and, honestly, healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. "Dr. Foster, you were given false information by someone who was very skilled at manipulation. The important thing is that the system worked. The hospital staff, the military family services, the legal system all eventually identified what was really happening." "That's gracious of you to say, but I've been thinking about that day for 3 years. Your sister was very convincing, very detailed in her concerns, and she presented documentation that seemed to support her claims. But I should have insisted on speaking with you privately, on corroborating her concerns with medical staff, and on following proper assessment protocols." She paused, glancing toward the hearing room where testimony was resuming. "I've actually implemented new protocols in my practice specifically because of what happened that day. No family crisis assessments without direct observation, no interventions based solely on third-party reports, and mandatory verification with multiple sources before any recommendations. That's exactly the kind of systemic change we're hoping this legislation will encourage. Rachel's tactics worked because she understood how to exploit the good faith assumptions that most family service professionals make.
We need protocols that protect families from sophisticated manipulation while still allowing for genuine intervention when children are actually at risk. As we returned to the hearing room for the final session of testimony, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since the day Rachel had tried to cut Sophia's hospital bracelet. The vulnerable new mother who'd been afraid to contradict her sister had become someone who testified before Congress, advocated for policy changes, and worked with military families across the country who were dealing with similar harassment. But more importantly, I'd learned the difference between being loved and being controlled, between being supported and being managed, between family that celebrates your growth and family that demands your compliance. Mrs. Sullivan, Congresswoman Santos said as the hearing reconvened, "Do you have any final thoughts for the committee?" I looked out at the room full of people who were working to protect military families, at my husband whose career had been strengthened rather than damaged by his fierce protection of our family, at my daughter who was growing up with confidence and security, and I felt the full weight of how far we'd all come. Congresswoman, 3 years ago, my sister tried to convince everyone that I was making poor choices, that my husband was unsuitable for our family, and that my daughter would be better off with different arrangements. She was willing to commit federal crimes to prove her point. I paused, making sure my words carried the weight I intended. Today, my husband has been promoted to Commandant of the Marine Corps, recognizing his leadership and his understanding that protecting families strengthens military readiness. I'm testifying before Congress about policies that will protect thousands of military families. And my daughter is growing up secure in the knowledge that when someone threatens her family, there are people with the power and authority to ensure there are consequences. I smiled, thinking about Rachel in her halfway house, working data entry and attending mandatory counseling sessions while we testified about legislation that would make her tactics a federal crime. The woman who'd tried to cut my newborn hospital bracelet had inadvertently created a legacy of protection for military families across America. And I'd learned that sometimes the best response to someone trying to diminish your light is to shine so brightly that it changes the world for everyone who comes after you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.